Good evening, everybody. My name's Bunjalini Duran. My people are the part of the Kulin Nation. My people come from western Kulin, where the Grampians and where the sacred trees are, on Western Highway there. It's my mother's people. It's part of the Kulin Nation, where we are now. It's eastern Kulin. And our law is the law of Bunjil. It's the land of the eagle. My name's Bunjalini, and it's a real honour to be here tonight to be involved with Julian Assange and what he represents. I want to acknowledge the Woiwurrung people, the Bunurong people, which is just to the south. This is Woiwurrung, and many clans amongst that. And the Dutagala is where Flemington Racecourse is. The Mooney clan was where Mooney Valley is. Merry, all clans. All have been occupying those lands in a sustainable, organised way for hundreds of thousands of years before colonialism descended on us. It's the beginning of the end of the world as we knew it, as our elders said. Australia is just one monumental lie, folks. Sorry about that, but that's what it is. And it's the denialism in this country is what its biggest danger is, the denial of its true sovereignty, the true history of this country. And it's created or manifest into what we have today. It's launched so far to the right. Why? Because this society allowed it to. Because they couldn't deal with their own truth. These two feathers represent the law of this land. You know, in the Southern Cross, there's two pointers, two white cockatoos, the Bram Bolt brothers, the keepers of the law. Proper law, not colonialism, not capitalism, not Christianity, none of that. That's blasphemy. It's lies, deceit, fraud, propaganda and race hatred indoctrination. Now, I want to stand here and say we stand in solidarity with our brother Julian Assange, what he represents. It's really a dangerous time for Australia and the whole world. Now, what kids out there would want to be an investigative journalist, want to travel abroad? These people will sacrifice you. And that's what they've done. Australia has sacrificed Julian. No one's standing up in that system for him. So, if we haven't got the truth or trust in our world, what have we got? We got nothing. So I really appreciate the people turning up and the support that he gets. And I hope we can see it through and make sure he comes home safely. He's an Australian citizen. And this country's obligated, but not that Australia takes any notice of international convention laws. And look at refugees, women, children, race discrimination, genocide convention, or missing in action, those things. We need to understand ourselves and live the truth. Now people can just point to Australia and say, hey, don't you talk about human rights abuses? Look at your own record, look at your own backyard. You need to be able to stand up in the face of the truth. This is where Australia fails miserably. They can't deal with the truth. They can't deal with the reality. There's never consent given to anybody by our people. There's no treaties. Australia's the only Commonwealth country without a treaty. What do you think that means after 250 years of unchecked colonialism means? What sort of government you're going to have? Now, you don't get democracy on blood-stained, illegally occupied land. Don't work, folks. And you've got to start again. You need to have, not that this Victorian treaty is any good. no good intent in that process. I believe in treaty. That process is no good. You need to have a treaty of peace with our ancestors. You need to make peace with the ancestors of this land. There's pressures not just from the truth, the climate too. Like our people said, the land is the only law here. It's the law of the land. At the end of the day, that's what it's about. And we live with that law forever. And we'll never change that, no matter what you do to our people. So I want to stand here and say that we're in solidarity with our brother, and he better come home. Because there's a lot of embassies in this country all feeding off this crime scene, Australia. Everyone's got their industries here. We need to take them to task. What are you doing about this? Who's running with this Australia state? Time to step up. I'm really glad that you're here, and I'd just like to say thank you to all the speakers this night. It looks like a great range of speakers. And I'm sure they're going to let you know what's going on with Julian. I think it's a real concern. Sitting in isolation like that, it'll kill you. Our people spent a couple of generations in detention, including offshore, Palm Island, Rottnest Island, death camps for our people. We spent a couple of generations in those places. They brutalised us, tortured us. And probably the worst form of torture is assimilation. Like a slow, torturous death, being forced to become something you despise most of all. That's how our people have lived in our own country. We're the most incarcerated people on earth. Been disgusting, that figure the whole time. And when you nut it down and see it's always the Indigenous people from country in jails here. Anyway, we all know Australia's a crime scene. It's the mining companies that run this country. They dictate here. It's Corporation Australia. United Nations, I don't know if they're worth anything either. What have they been doing? There's been no relief from genocide for our people. Just the International Criminal Court, should have a look at what George Brand has done over there recently, securing special measures and special considerations for Australia when it comes to human rights crimes and violations. And they did that with the United Nations too, with the Genocide Convention. Where is it? If that had been in existence, maybe things might have been a little bit different. All the people that died in jail, removed children, these mining companies destroying the environment, no accountability to anybody. But I'm going to get off here and just say thanks for having me here, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak on a stage that supports Julian Assange. Good on you.
Thank you so much, Robbie, for that definitely broad-ranging but absolutely wonderful welcome to country. And I think when I say this, I speak for everyone in the audience. My name is Lizzie O'Shea. I'm an author and a lawyer, and I am fortunate enough to be your host for the evening. We've seen recent raids on broadcasts and journalists in Australia, as well as the criminalisation of whistleblowing, for precisely the kind of journalism that's cost Julian Assange a decade of his life, and this has really prompted a considerable debate about the role of the free press in this country and the role of investigative journalists who are reporting on national security issues. And I think this is part of a growing movement of people who are concerned about Australia's slide towards authoritarianism. And in fact, what Julian Assange's plight exemplifies that in my mind, and I think a lot of people here would agree. And so I wanted to start by thanking everybody who's come tonight and to thank the many volunteers who've contributed to putting this event on, in particular Felicity as well, to show that this is a movement of people who are concerned about this particular issue and they want to do something about it. And I think that's a wonderful sign. And tonight we're going to talk about what this issue means and what kinds of things we can do to stop this slide towards authoritarianism. So the way that we plan to run this evening is that we've got Kristinn here from WikiLeaks to speak for a period of time. I'll introduce the rest of our panel, and once Kristinn's finished speaking, we'll have a broad-ranging discussion, after which there'll be time for questions from the audience. So allow me to introduce our panel. Kristinn Hrafnsson spent 2 decades of his working life as a journalist in Iceland and was named Icelandic Journalist of the Year 3 times in 2004, 2007 and 2010 by Iceland's National Union of Journalists, who is the only journalist to ever receive this award 3 times. In his reporting on the collapse of Iceland's Kaupthing Bank, he used documents from WikiLeaks. In 2010, he established Sunshine Press Productions in Iceland together with Julian Assange, before taking over from Assange as editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks in September 2018. Hrafnsson served as the platform's spokesperson for 6 years. Next to him is Julian Burnside, AOQC, who is an Australian barrister who practices principally in commercial litigation, trade practices and administrative law. He is perhaps best known as a human rights and refugee advocate, as well as being an author. Julian stood as a candidate for the Greens in his local electorate of Kuyong in the 2019 federal election. And lastly, we have Dr. Suelette Drefus, who is the founder and executive director of Blueprint for Free Speech. Suelette's career has spanned academia, journalism and advocacy. She's a specialist in cybersecurity technologies and integrity systems that work as corrective mechanisms in society. Before earning her PhD and writing a book, which has been translated into 7 languages, she worked as a I'll let everyone applaud. She worked as a staff journalist at Australia's largest selling newspaper. I'm going to hand over to Kristinn now to allow him to speak for about 10 or so minutes, and then we'll have a discussion about what he's had to say.
Thank you, Lizzie. I am particularly happy to be here in the last sort of 3 city tour that I am doing here on this visit. I was in Sydney, Canberra, now in Melbourne. It is an important place. This is after all, it's the birthplace of WikiLeaks. This is where it all started, where the journey began in much happier times. And in those happier times, back in the days when things were easier, when Julie and I could sit and talk freely about the past, he told me stories about what had transpired here in the city. And some of these stories came back to me today, driving through this beautiful city. Stories of him putting up the first free internet service provider in the city. Him assisting the police in eradicating a pedophile ring successfully. Now this is the person I knew in the days, a person that hasn't changed in his heart. This is what I learned about him when we discussed internet freedom and information freedom. Me being this square journalist from the mainstream media after 20 years of practice there, getting a bit desperate about where mainstream media was going, and he coming from this environment, from this background, where we shared ideals, and it quickly aspired into friendship, and then cooperation, and we became co-workers, and the rest is history. Now, I saw him in Belmarsh prison about a month ago, and his state is deteriorating. It is absolutely horrifying that a man, Julian Assange, should be sitting in a maximum security prison on remand under worse circumstances than most terrorists who are serving sentences in that prison, according to lawyers who know the environment and who have worked inside Belmarsh prison. That is absolutely unacceptable that a journalist and a publisher that has done nothing wrong, done nothing but practiced journalism, he had committed the crime of journalism, as we say, should be sitting there. When I come from these meetings and finally get out of the 3 double door locks and get my belongings back, because I can't even take a pencil inside or a paper, it takes a while to get back faith in humanity, because it's so heartbreaking to leave him behind inside there, seeing his health deteriorate, his weight loss becoming more apparent, and slowly seeing the light of life fading out of his eyes. It just cannot continue. A line has been crossed. A red line has been crossed. I don't have to go into much technical details, because I'm fairly certain that most of you know the elements of the case, the overreach by the empire, by the US empire, who is taking it up upon itself to have a universal jurisdiction, taking the right that they can fetch an Australian citizen into English territory for acts that were performed in England, in Germany, in Sweden, in my home country, Iceland. This is totally unacceptable. We cannot accept that. And for what? For what they call espionage. He is the first individual, he is the first journalist who is indicted on the basis of a 101-year-old Espionage Act, a relic from the First World War, where actually lawmakers at the time were warning of the possible abuse of that legal framework. And it lay dormant for decades, up until the Obama administration, where they found it in a drawer and started using it to persecute whistleblowers. We said at the time, this is only the beginning. This is laying the groundwork for what is to come. Whistleblowers first, and the sources, but they will come after journalists. That's going to be the next step. And now they've crossed that line as well, and Julian Assange is the first. Unless we do not take action and say enough is enough, he will not be the last. The precedent will be set of the extraterritorial reach and the use of this ridiculous legal framework to equate journalism with espionage. We must fight for his freedom, and we must fight for his life, because if he is extradited to the United States, he will end his life in a maximum security prison in the US. It is de facto a death penalty if he is thrown on a rendition flight and flown across the Atlantic to the United States. Now, on my travel here in the last few days, I have sensed that there is support, there is growing support for Julian Assange. I'm not saying I saw a lot of it in Canberra, but there is support among the general public. I have met probably on 3 meetings, or 4 meetings rather, including the National Press Club event yesterday, 100+ journalists. And I sensed that they understand the implication. You might say it's because of self-interest, but wherever it comes from, they understand, they are beginning to understand. This movement that has been brought forward, of course, is partly to thank the good work of many individuals. And some of you are here tonight, and I really want to thank you for your work. It doesn't often take numbers to change history. I often reflect back to the Drefus case in the about 1895, I think. The officer Drefus in France was brought before a court and sentenced to life imprisonment on the basis of treason, of espionage. And if you reflect back to that history, it is a an amazing similarity. And everybody in France knows of this case, and people outside France as well, because it's a symbolic case that of a travesty of justice that should never be forgotten. Drefus was dragged in front of a secret court. Sounds familiar? They planted evidence. They smeared his name. And in the end, he was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to Devil's Island off the coast of Latin America to serve the rest of his remaining life. One commentator at the time, he described the atmosphere in Paris and in France as such that the only regret the general public had about the Drefus case, that the death penalty had just recently been abolished for violations of that nature. Such hatred was against Drefus. And there was nobody in the beginning who stood up to defend his name, except one person, his brother, who just didn't want to see this happening, who recognized the injustice, and of course wanted to save his brother's lives. So he started campaigning, one man, and little by little he made progress. He got the intellectuals on board. They started campaigning and writing, and of course we all know the famous front page letter by Émile Zola, J'accuse, which he had to pay a price for. He was actually sentenced for defamation and had to flee the country to London, of all places, and spend 2 years there. And the momentum grew, because people are good people when they see and get the evidence, when they are presented with the evidence and somebody cares and raises the alarm. And within 10 years, he was back in France. His reputation was reinstated, he was cleaned of all charges, offered back into the military and served in the First World War. It took 10 years, going from absolute zero, from death, to restored life. So even though times are dark, you should never give up. Crowd of one man in the street, holding a sign, a group of individuals fighting. It's not the numbers, it's the principle. And I sense the numbers are growing. More and more people are aware that this is unacceptable and we must fight it. We need to use the momentum. We need to convince the journalists to write the truth about what's going on in this country and elsewhere. And we need the journalists and the public to put a pressure on the politicians in this country who have absolutely done nothing to help Julian Assange. That is unacceptable, that an Australian citizen should be abandoned by his own government. And you should all tell the politicians that it's unacceptable. But we should not give up. There's a fight ahead, and we don't have much time. There's a hearing on the extradition on February 25th. But that's not the end of it. There will be appeals. But I'm certain that justice will prevail, because it's the right thing to do. Enough people will understand, slowly and gradually, that they don't want the dishonor of having to answer questions from their children or their grandchildren in the future when they are asked, where were you? Did you stay silent? Did you do nothing? Or did you help Julian Assange? That's the right thing to do. I hope that you will assist me and all others in raising the alarm and get him out of this place that he's in. Thank you.
I might start by bringing in our other panellists with the question of when they, or what can they remember about what they first heard about WikiLeaks? Shall we start with you, Julian?
Well, actually, I can't remember when I first heard about WikiLeaks. You didn't give me any warning of that question. But I can tell you...
I object to that. I did give you some warning.
I first met Assange in the 1990s, early 1990s, I think, when I acted for him because I was doing a lot of computer law stuff, and he was charged with being a teenage hacker. And I'd totally forgotten until I met him again in 2012 in the embassy. So, is that okay?
That's a very good answer.
When,
Well
did,
done.
when did I first learn about WikiLeaks?
Yes. Well, Suelette, let's go to you.
So I've known Julian for a very long time. I got to know him around 1994. So I was, of course, 2, right? No, I wasn't actually 2. But we got to know each other in part because he was co-running the first free public access internet site here in Australia. And it was a haven for artists and writers and activists and creatives, programmers, people who wanted to contribute things to the community. And even then, he was an adamant publisher. So he would allow people to publish things on the site, which were controversial and difficult, including articles backed up by evidence about Scientology and a set of other things. And he was pretty brave. He dealt with lawyers' letters and threats and other assaults on it, but he was willing to stand up for it. And then I knew him all during this period because he was very involved in the free software movement. For those of you who don't know much about the technology side of things, you obviously know Julian Assange has got technical skills, but you may not know that for more than a decade he contributed an enormous amount, thousands of hours, to developing free software. And in fact, for some of you who might use an Apple computer, there is probably free software in there by Julian Assange. So he wrote software that helped to develop one of the operating systems of a variety of Unix. He contributed all of this labor for free. He wrote software that helped to make the news function of the early internet function in a more optimized way, which meant it was easier for more people to get news. He designed and wrote, and I was part of the project, that developed the first open source software that was deniable cryptography file system. This was envisaged to be used by human rights groups around the world. It allowed you to store, for example, on a hard drive, multiple layers of encrypted files so that if human rights workers taking witness statements in Guatemala about genocide against the original peoples in Cambodia, in Sri Lanka, took witness statements in rural areas and put them on these hard drives, they could add a layer of something else on the top with a different password. And if they were seized and tortured, they could give the password to that layer with very little information on it, and the other layer would never be discoverable. He wrote free software available, gave it away to everyone, which allowed people to test the cybersecurity robustness of their computer systems connected to the internet. So much of this is not known about Julian, and it's an incredible act of altruism to contribute in this free software community, but that in itself was many years of work.
Thanks for that. So I do want to talk now straight into it, talking about some of these recent raids on journalists in Australia. So I just wanted to remind people about this. On June the 4th, police conducted a raid of Annika Smethurst's house, which they went through her personal belongings. It was relating to a story she'd published revealing a proposal for electronic intelligence agencies, the Australian Signals Directorate, which is obviously an intelligence arm of the intelligence agencies. They were planning to take on an expanded domestic role and that figures within government were concerned about this, and that was the substance of her story, which prompted then the raid. And then on June the 5th, just a day later, the Sydney headquarters of the ABC were raided over a 2017 series about accusations of war crimes committed by Australia's special forces in Afghanistan. Both those stories to me seem clearly within the public interest, and I think a lot of people were quite concerned about these raids being associated with those stories. I mean, it obviously raises questions about what is the right line to draw when public interest journalism conflicts with the interests of the national security state, some of which may be legitimate, but some of which may not be. Julian, were you surprised that these raids occurred? What do you think that they reflect generally about the state of the Australian democracy?
I was surprised that they occurred, and I was shocked that they occurred. And it suggests that journalism is in real trouble in this country. In fact, all of us are in real trouble in this country. I imagine not many people in this room are aware of the case of Witness J. Not Witness K with Bernard Collaery, but Witness J. Witness J served for, I think, 10 years in the armed services, in the intelligence branch of the armed services. He was then tried secretly and convicted and jailed secretly in the ACT for some sort of intelligence offence. We're not allowed to know what it was because it's all secret. He was held, I think, 15 months in a jail in the ACT, and even the ACT Attorney General did not know of his case. That's how secret it all was. Witness J began writing an anonymous autobiography with all relevant names and details anonymised. The federal police heard about this and executed a raid on his police cell and a raid on his home. And it was only through that process that he discovered that he's the subject of a lifetime ban on saying anything at all about anything he experienced in his time with the military. Now, open justice is a profoundly important element of any democratic society. You heard Kristinn refer before to the trial of Drefus in France in the late 19th century, but in 1916, Sir Roger Casement was tried in London for treason, which is about as serious as it gets. It was an open trial, and you could get the transcript then. You can read the transcript now. After the Second World War, the man who was known as Lord Haw Haw was tried for treason in an open trial. Now, if open trials were okay for them in England, why can't we have open trials in Australia? Why is it that the Attorney General can authorise suppression orders to be made by courts in circumstances where the national security interest is said to be at risk? Now, the national security interest and our present Attorney General are not a comfortable mix. It's worth reflecting on the fact that one of the signs that was up before was prosecute the war criminals and free Julian Assange. Well, our politicians, including people like Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison, have committed serious crimes against humanity in their time. They can't be prosecuted. And by the way, I know Peter Dutton's pretty unpopular, but I think Scott Morrison's the worst politician we've ever had in this country. Mainly because he's a dishonest hypocrite. And I've been saying that for a few years and haven't even had a letter of demand from his lawyers. Yes. Anyway, the point is that they have been guilty. Many people in our government have been guilty of crimes against humanity, not least because of their treatment of asylum seekers, but they can't be prosecuted except with the written approval of the Attorney General. That's part of Australia's law. That same Attorney General who refuses to prosecute members of his own party or members of the opposition who are likewise guilty of crimes against humanity, that Attorney General has power to authorise a prosecutor to ask the court for a secret trial. Now, that debases one of the most fundamental principles of the freedom of the press and the democratic system. We really need to be alarmed at the fact that the case of Witness J was possible in this country. We need to be alarmed at the fact that we have a government which introduced laws which allow the Liberal Attorney General to apply to a court for secrecy orders in relation to any prosecution. Leave aside a prosecution that involves national security interests, whatever that may mean in the particular circumstances. We really need to stand up for open justice. Otherwise, any one of you could just disappear overnight and no one would know where you'd gone. Even if you've been taken off and tried secretly and jailed secretly, no one would be allowed to say where you were, no one would be allowed to know where you were or why you disappeared. That is very alarming. And it's something that every Australian should be alarmed about. Not just the people who are at the cutting edge of protest against the government, but every one of us. because every one of us is capable of being that one man in the street that Kristinn spoke about, that one man in the street who starts the movement. If you're that person, you better be worried, because we have a government that is willing to jump on you. And I think the responsibility of every single one of us here tonight is that we should get angry at our government and at the opposition. Have you heard any Labor members opposing the fact of Witness J? Not one. You need to get angry at the government, get angry at the opposition, get active to oppose these things which make all this sort of stuff possible. And as Kristinn said, never give up. Never give up. Never give up.
So, Suelette, I wanted to talk a little bit more about then the practice of journalism in Australia, in part because what I think these raids show, and some of the issues that Julian was just talking about, is that being a national security journalist or covering national security topics in Australia is a very perilous business. And I did then want to talk about what was the particular contribution of, say, WikiLeaks to this field of national security reporting. It's obviously WikiLeaks is a specific mode of publishing in that it does give access to source material. I wondered if you could talk a bit about that from the perspective of a journalist.
So a lot of the media has focused on all sorts of criticisms of Julian that are really strange and pedantic, small, minor things, but has missed the big picture. And that's unfortunate, because if you look at the ways in which he, as the editor of WikiLeaks, transformed how we receive news and information, they are quite extraordinary. So the anonymous digital Dropbox, largely a WikiLeaks invention. We look around today and we see the New York Times, Bloomberg Media, we see Gizmodo, for those who use it, NBC, Dagbladet, Norwegian, the CBC, which is the ABC of Canada, as well as the ABC here, using anonymous digital Dropboxes for whistleblowers to provide information to journalists in the public interest. That came about because of Julian Assange. We see the popularized use of data set journalism, that is, taking large sets of data, analyzing it and looking for patterns and trends to understand what's really happening to then tell the story. That is largely because of Julian Assange. We see the kind of invented verification journalism. That is not just that you do the analysis with the data set, but you publish it with the story. You do that to prove to your readers the story you are telling is truthful. And that's extra important in an era of fake news. That is largely true and popularized because of Julian Assange. We see collaborative global partnerships in journalism across countries and publications on a scale that was never seen before across different companies and organizations. Some 90 plus different media organizations, not in the same company, not in the same media family, because of Julian Assange. And we see a popularization of cybersecurity training of journalists, much more widespread. I've been very active in some of it. That has largely happened because of Julian Assange. So these are all really important innovations for journalism, but it actually goes beyond that. We are sitting in a state library. Libraries are valuable archives of information. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks has created perhaps the most important archive, online library of information, of data around international, US international public policy making and decision making, particularly around war decisions, war policy, that for the modern era that exists today. And it is not behind closed walls in a private collection. It's not even inaccessible on books on a shelf. It's available to everyone, free today and searchable. And that is because of Julian Assange's vision. So I think those are all things that are really important to recognize that in their totality are extraordinary. Any one of them would have been a kind of lifetime achievement for someone who is a publisher, a journalist who cares about access to public information. But all of them together provide a life's work over a decade and a half that is just exceptional.
Kristinn, I wanted to come back to you because I want you to give it to us straight. Reporters Without Borders has ranked Australia as 21st in the world for press freedom in 2019, dropping 2 places since last year. We've talked about these raids, obviously, but the constitutional lawyer George Williams has pointed out that since September 11, 2001, we've had 75 rounds of national security legislation of varying degrees of seriousness for the practice of national security journalism. What is our reputation abroad, or what's your perspective as an outsider in terms of our freedom of the press and the effect that that has on democracy?
Well, what I knew about the press in this country before I met Julian and throughout was limited. I knew there was a concentration of ownership, same problem we see in other territories, which of course is problematic. I learned about the usual attempt to stifle public broadcaster through strangling or limiting the blood flow, basically through budgetary cuts. That is a problem that is occurring everywhere, seeing that as a pattern. I think that the press freedom in Australia, as observed by other nations, is that it is relatively okay. I was actually stunned to learn just recently about all these legal actions that have been taken against press freedom and civil liberties in this country, 70 plus legislation since the turn of the century, since 9/11, basically. So I was a bit surprised to get to know the serious situation, or the level of the limitations that the press in Australia have to deal with. But I also want to say that you see that in other countries as well. Press freedom is under attack all over the world, and the attack on journalists are happening in every country on a more regular basis than before. And partly the raids here this summer were possibly a pattern that you could link to the arrest of Julian Assange on April 11, in that disgraceful manner that when he was arrested and dragged out of the embassy. I believe that event emboldened those who want to crack down on press freedom. I think there's a link between what happened there and what happened here in June. I think there's a link between what happened to Julian and the attacks on journalists in Brazil, where journalists like Graham Greenwald might face prosecution and arrest. There have been arrests in the United States as well. I was at the Bundestag in Germany just 2 days before flying to Australia, and I heard of cases, very worrisome cases, in European countries. So this is a universal thing, and it's all linked together. This is a concentrated attack on press freedom all over the world. And when one government takes steps like here in Australia, it sends a signal. It sends a signal it's okay. So it's like a virus, it will spread. So we have to fight back now before everything is lost. Very important we do that.
If what Julian Assange did was a problem, let's be candid. Back when WikiLeaks published that stuff about what had happened in Iraq, not many people were getting news from WikiLeaks. The reason all of us heard about it was because of the Murdoch press. The Murdoch press republished the juicy bits. Now, no one is going after Rupert Murdoch saying he's a criminal. No one is trying to extradite him to anywhere or prosecute him for anything. What is it that Assange has done that Murdoch didn't do? Apart from the fact that he brought it to the attention of fewer people. Now, I think that's the thing you need to take real account of if you're concerned about freedom of the press. The press is sort of selectively free. if you're a big mogul, then you can do or say what you like. America is trying to extradite Assange from Britain right now on espionage charges which do not attract the First Amendment defence. The First Amendment defence, you'll recall, became very important for Daniel Ellsberg in connection with Watergate, because although the original material had been leaked illegally, and the leaking, no doubt, was a criminal offence, the publication of it was said by the Supreme Court of the US not to be a criminal offence because of the First Amendment. Now, if that's right, we ought to be outraged that the American government is now trying to extradite him to America, and as Kristinn said, it will amount to a life sentence. He faces the prospect of dying in jail over there. And let's not be coy about this. The person who leaked the material to him, who's now known as Chelsea Manning, has recently been thrown in jail by a grand jury, placed in an all-male jail by the authorities, but held in solitary confinement to protect him from the other male prisoners because he's transsexual. Now, if that's not an indication of where America is going, I don't know what else is. We really need to be very worried about the state of journalism and the risk at which journalists stand. Julian Assange is a great illustration of that. He shouldn't be. He doesn't deserve it. I think I'd be less animated about this if Rupert Murdoch was facing the same fate. But even for him, I would say his rights need to be defended. And Assange's rights need to be defended, and your rights need to be defended, because what is happening to journalism across the West puts all of us at risk. We are seeing, with cases like Witness J and the treatment of Assange and Australia's total indifference to it, we are seeing Australia developing into a kind of, what should I say? I was going to say autocracy, but a dictatorship, something like that. And it's very worrying. It should concern every single one of you.
Just on a note, when I met Daniel Ellsberg in London a few years ago, he, of course, reminded me that they tried to pin the Espionage Act on him. This was in the early 70s, Nixon era, unsuccessfully. And he told me something that sort of stuck to me. He said, if I were in my battle today, in our times, I would never see daylight again. I would not have won. So when we reflect on the past, we usually think we have progressed to something better. People look back at Nixon and the Vietnam War and that era as, a time of darkness and eroding civil liberties. But actually, we are worse off now than in the height of the Nixon era. How scary is that?
Well, that's what actually I wanted to talk about now. Of course, there's journalists who are threatened by these laws, and obviously then the execution of these laws by various government officials. But there's also sources and whistleblowers that face very serious consequences for revealing information. And I wanted to raise not just Chelsea Manning, but also the ATO whistleblower, Richard Boyle. He's now been charged with 66 offences and faces potentially 161 years in prison, which I think is an astonishing figure. Suelette, you obviously work quite a bit with whistleblowers and similar kind of sources. Do you want to talk a little bit about the very serious threats that are facing sources?
So whistleblowers, the good news is they are at least being properly recognised as whistleblowers. The bad news is we have a long way to travel yet. And speaking about the ATO Boyle case, this is not some obscure thing in another country outside Australia. This is a whistleblower who blew the whistle on the ATO not following its own policies and procedures about garnishing money out of people's bank accounts. The government's ability to reach into your bank account and take money out of it. It's really important to follow policy and procedures on that, because otherwise you end up with an authoritarian state that, is not what we all signed up for. So, but it's not only the Boyle case, it's internationally. It's the Jeffrey Sterling case. This was a former CIA officer who was a whistleblower. This case is very interesting out of the United States because we think it's the first case where a whistleblower has been convicted on the basis of metadata. So not actually on, we were there recording the secret conversation you had with a journalist, but we have the little electronic breadcrumb trail that connects you. And that was the basis of his conviction time in prison. We've seen another disturbing trend. So in Europe, we've seen the Ana Garrido case. In Spain, she worked in the Madrid town hall. She revealed corruption at a local level, and 10 years on, the truth came out. It went all the way up to national politics and caused the fall of the government and the president in Spain. We've seen the case of Andrea Franzoso revealing fraud in a state-owned company in Italy. Antoine Deltour, the LuxLeaks case, revealing sweet deals by his government behind the scenes on tax lurks for large multinational companies. We've seen the Gupta case in South Africa, cozy ties between a wealthy family and the president's office. And we've also seen the John Doe case with the Panama Papers. So one of the most disturbing trends, though, that we've seen more recently here in Australia is that government is not only going after whistleblowers, it's now going after the journalists, as we've heard, going after the lawyers in the case of Bernard Collaery. And I might say, earlier this year, I was due to speak at the largest cybersecurity conference in Australia, and merely for floating the idea of the thought bubble in a conversation about my talk of maybe it would be interesting to have a teleconference at the conference with Edward Snowden, I was actually censored from speaking at the conference. I was disinvited from the conference, in part because I was told I might say things that weren't representative of Australian values. I like that, Australian. It's important that our cybersecurity centre should be the organisation whose mission statement it is to set Australian values. But the idea that because I had spoken out on issues regarding whistleblowing and the impact of digital technologies on it, somehow I was too dangerous to speak in public. It's quite extraordinary. And so now it's not just the lawyers, it's not just the journalists, it's not just the whistleblowers, it's also the academics. But I do want to say one bit of hope. There is a little bit of shining light in here. And this is, again, a contribution I think that WikiLeaks has made to the landscape. There has been a significant expansion in the number of laws around the world that protect whistleblowers over the last decade. And there is no doubt that the existence of both Julian Assange and WikiLeaks has contributed to the awareness that has pushed for that change. So we have now more than 49 countries that have whistleblower protection laws. We have more than 100 countries that have some form of protection for whistleblowers, even if they're not standalone laws. We saw a large number of those happen, particularly in the last decade. That's been Ireland in 2014, Serbia 2015, France 2016, Ukraine this year 2019. The EU directive that passed in April this year will apply to all the European member states, and they have to transpose them into their national laws by 2021. So this is actually forward movement. These laws are not perfect. They have plenty of holes. The Commonwealth law that was passed here in Australia in 2013 has many flaws. However, those things came about.
It doesn't work.
Like it doesn't. But what those things have been is caused by the rising up of civil society, of academics, of lawyers, of average people of all different backgrounds, technologists, who have pushed for this protection to be embedded in law. And yes, they will be improved. We saw a little bit of advancement here in Australia 2019 with amendments to corporate law to expand this protection to some degree to the private sector. Again, not perfect. But the fact that we're seeing this forward progress should be an indicator to everyone that sitting on your hands is not the answer. Getting up and speaking up is the answer, because it is starting to have an impact.
and especially because, as Kristinn said, a line has been crossed. And we're all on the wrong side of the line. Remember that.
And if it, and if I may add, Suelette, you mentioned that they are going after sources and now journalists and lawyers. And yesterday we got the news that an Australian citizen who is now residing in London, who has been doing artwork for WikiLeaks. He is a designer. He was informed by Google that his email had been subpoenaed by the secret grand jury in the case Redacted versus Redacted. So the guy who did the graphic design, the artist, they're not safe anymore.
So I want to talk now quite specifically about Julian Assange. Kristinn, can you tell us what is the kind of timetable that we're facing? What are the next steps in his particular case?
The timetable is such that, the formal hearing will be on February 25th. It will take days. We'll probably have a decision in the court 6 to 8 weeks after that. There will certainly be appeal, and that might take up to almost another year. So then there is the Supreme Court. So we might be looking at a fight that could take 2 to 3 years. And so it's not over. It will take a lot of energy. And so in the immediate time frame, we need to get him out of that situation. It's totally unacceptable that a man should be sitting on remand in a maximum security prison where he has to walk around with earplugs because of the sensory attacks, that situation. He can't think. How can a man prepare for the defense where they are ruling about his life or his death in such a situation? It's shameful, and that's where the Australian government must step in right away. They must pick up the phone and do something. And may I add, I am not optimistic about him getting anything that we can call a fair trial in British courts. I've been in the courtroom. I've seen how the smearing of his name has sort of seeped into the minds of the judges. They are so biased. They make snarky remarks to the man who is behind bulletproof glass in the docks, they've never seen before. He's there for the first time. He only has had his name and the date of birth, and they call him a narcissist. And what kind of courtroom is that? So it's never going to be a fair trial. It's not going to be a case that it will be won on the merit of the law, because the laws are on the side of Julian Assange. It is a political case, and as I've stated before, and I will state it again, he is a political prisoner in the United Kingdom.
And I think, if I may add this, I first visited him in the Ecuadorian embassy in 2012, not long after he'd gone in. With his input, I prepared a letter to the then Attorney General Nicola Roxon, part of the Labor government in 2012, and set out all the reasons why he was at serious risk of being sent to America if he was extradited to Sweden, and asking her to make sure that Australia helped him, an Australian citizen in difficulty. Would have been very simple then. All they would have had to do is reach a deal with the English government that he could travel directly from the Ecuadorian embassy to the airport and get on a flight to Australia. He would, in theory, be on English soil, but they could offer him protection as long as he went there directly. They did nothing. Then in 2017, I saw him again in the embassy, and I wrote a letter to Malcolm Turnbull, who did absolutely nothing. Neither of the major parties in this country have done anything to protect the rights of an Australian citizen who is facing all sorts of outrageous risks, and we should all be very afraid. It's disgraceful. There was something else I was going to say and I've forgotten it.
Well, can I ask you, Julian, if Kristinn is so kind, he might take these messages back. If you could say something to Julian Assange, what would you say to him?
Never give up. Same as for all of us. The other thing I was going to add was, as Kristinn said, it's outrageous that he's being held in a maximum security prison. His lawyer in London is Jen Robinson, who was here a couple of weeks ago. And Jen told me that lawyers' visiting hours in Belmarsh prison are 9 to 11 in the morning, but it takes her nearly an hour to get through security, including that she's strip-searched every time. Now, she then gets a limited amount of time with him, which is not private. That is not the circumstance in which a person is capable of preparing to face the trial of their lives. Now, Australia needs to do something to help an Australian citizen. I thought citizenship carried some benefits. So,
I think it's also really important to note here that this is a man who is currently innocent in the eyes of the law. So he served a term for skipping bail, which he did to seek asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. That term is finished. He is actually not serving a term for any criminal matter in the UK at this time. He is sitting behind bars as a man who is innocent in the eyes of the law there. So this is an extraordinary thing to keep him in a prison where this is the top security prison in Britain. This is the security prison where all of the alleged terrorists are kept. It's extraordinary. Is a publisher a terrorist?
I wanted to ask you the same question, Suelette, what you would say to Julian if he was in front of you, but I would just add that I'm about to open it up to questions from the floor. There's 2 roving mics for that purpose. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can indicate to the 2 lovely volunteers who are holding the mics and we'll get to you. We're also taking questions online through the... No, we're not. Okay, that's fine. Suelette, what would you say to Julian if he was in front of you?
I'd say, you are not alone. You are not alone.
Both of your messages were very pithy. I like it a lot. Okay, so to take it to the floor, are there any questions that we can see? Can I read out the message from the doctor? Oh, yes. Okay, so Felicity does have a message that she wanted to read out as well, so we might start with that.
Can you hear me? Yay. 2 of the 60 doctors that signed a very powerful statement last week that has made a big impact in raising awareness about Julian's issue are from Melbourne. And they couldn't be here tonight, but they wanted this message to be sent. Julian Assange, like other detainees, has a right to adequate health care, which, from the evidence of several experienced observers, he is being denied. This is totally unacceptable and makes a mockery of any pretense of justice or due process. It is imperative that he receive full and timely health care for any physical and mental health conditions. Many Australians are alarmed at our government's apparent abandonment of Julian Assange, which is all the more shameful given Assange's deteriorating health. It seems that the government cares more for hiding allegations of war crimes, such as the incidents that Assange helped bring to light, than for investigating them. At his recent court appearance, he was confused and unable to understand the proceedings. He has been independently assessed as having a major depression and likely post-traumatic stress disorder. It is highly inappropriate for him to continue to be at Belmarsh Prison, given his current situation. It's likely to be worsening his medical condition. He urgently needs medical expert care in a university-level hospital. So that's from 2 wonderful Melbourne doctors, Margaret Beavis and Sue Wareham.
Right, we've got a question here.
Hi, my name's Evram. I'm the president of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality Club at the University of Melbourne and a journalist for the World Socialist website. It's fortuitous that presentation was just made, because I was going to ask specifically Kristinn if you could comment on the significance of this powerful action taken by these doctors from around the world. Thanks.
Thanks, brother. It had an obvious impact. I could feel it right away, because the people understand, the general public understand that now the gravity of the situation. Before this letter, of course, we had Niels Melcher, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, speaking out about his health conditions. But all this helps, and this letter had a tremendous impact on the public perception, because people understand that journalists have a tendency of obfuscating the matter. Is he a journalist? Is he not a journalist? What about this and that? What about Russia? Even though Russia has nothing to do with it, or the democratic corruption in the Democratic Party. So it's very important. This was my message to the group of journalists that I met at the Sydney Morning Herald, at the National Press Club, at the 8th this morning. You have a duty to report the facts. You have a duty to unwind the situation and get it right, because you are complicit in getting it wrong. So now you have a duty to do it.
Yeah, over here on the left.
Oh, hi. You were talking before about how he's being held, an innocent man in Belmarsh. I really don't understand. What are the grounds that they're using to hold him? It seems... Is it just espionage? Is that the one condition that they're holding? Or is it because he skipped bail before, therefore he's a bail risk? Is that it? He's just a bail risk?
A flight risk, yes.
Flight risk.
It's because he's facing extradition. I don't know the provision which they've used, but apparently if a person is sought to be extradited and might nick off, then they can hold him.
He served his time for that offence?
No, served his time for skipping bail.
Yes, skipping bail.
Yep. He's
Which
now
is a flight
subject
risk.
of an extradition application by the Americans, and presumably there's some provision which allows the authorities to keep him in jail so that he can't disappear during the extradition.
Be a maximum security prison. So, and in fact, often if you are on remand, you're not in prison at all.
Mm.
People want to ask a question, maybe they can line up here.
Yeah. Hello, yeah, I've had for some years taking a lot of initiatives on my own to help Julian Assange, and on one occasion I've actually printed and distributed my own leaflets, and I've done so today as well. Look, what I really need is to see a lot more public activism in Australia to support Julian Assange. We need a lot more public protest. We need, what I'd like to see is an open committee of people where anyone in this room can go along, and people who want to do something, who want to take further actions to support Julian Assange can meet together. What I would like the committee, the people who have called this meeting today, to do is maybe initiate such a campaign so that starting in the near future we can come together and meet again and plan further actions to support Julian Assange.
Yeah, hello, my name is Walter. I just have a question for the two legal people, and that is, do we have any chance to put pressure on our government on faulty administrative processes to start another legal procedure? Yeah? And I think we have a very willing IBC that is with the night show and so that is probably looking for stuff to happen to report.
Great. Can we take a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Can I just clarify what you mean by that? When you say you want to know if there's any action that can be taken, you mean here in Australia? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, it looks as if our government officers are not doing their job. Yeah?
Right.
So starting a legal process for defective administration on the Australian side, yeah, the consular
I'm not sure
support
whether
doesn't
there's
seem to work.
I'm not sure if there's a legal action available in Australia, but what you can do is influence the politics. And there's one thing about Australian politics, is that politicians are very twitchy if the journalists say bad things about them. And I think what we do need is for the journalists to come out of hiding and say publicly and openly all the stuff that is being suffered by Assange, and that the government should do something about it. Because frankly, as soon as public attitudes shift, the politics will shift.
It's already beginning to happen. So, for example, one journalist I know who's always been very critical of Julian Assange has come out recently, and what he, well, not necessarily supporting him, what he has come out to say is there's a noticeable groundswell of activity and support for Julian Assange happening across Australia. So this has taken his notice, and this is something where I think all of you could contribute, because journalists do take notice of it, even the ones that might not necessarily be sympathetic to his plight on a humanitarian basis.
I might just come across here. Jacob, you've got someone?
Hi, my name's Tom. Way back in the 1960s, there was an individual locked up in a prison in London, quite popular gentleman by the name of Mick Jagger. And there was a large petition signed by many, many, many people in the press. And that was the power of the press. And that's how it seems to be about the only difference here. You know, the press is completely silent everywhere, both sides of politics. And all the governments of Britain, America and Australia just sitting on their hands while he is being tortured and destroyed in this situation that he's in. And the difference with Mick Jagger was that all these people just came up there. I mean, he was a popular personality, but he was on a drug charge, whether it was trumped up or not. And everyone said it was like, you know, breaking a butterfly on a wheel. And I was wondering what Julian Assange in prison now, what materials he has. Like you said that they weren't allowed to bring a pencil into prison. What materials does he have to collect his thoughts and run his case?
Well, he is now being allowed to retain the legal papers that his lawyers bring to him. That only changed a few weeks ago. For months he was sitting there without any possibility of going through his legal papers. So things have changed a bit to the better after he has served the sentence on late September, and he gets mail and appreciates that. A lot of mail from supporters. He gets occasional sort of short briefings about what's going on, which is very important. We try to get to him information about the support, and we heard back just that he was really heartened by the support that he got at the Walkley Award the other day, which is another indication that there's a turnaround in the journalist community, and that is something that I actually experienced when I met journalists here in meetings at the newspapers, and so I think there's a change there, and there's a willingness to do something. And I was actually asked by journalists at meetings, what can we do? By some journalists, there may be obstacles among the editors, but they are also slowly and gradually understanding that they might be in the docks soon. The editor of even The Guardian, who have been very hostile, WikiLeaks and Julian particularly, have come out to say this extradition cannot go forward. So change is coming, but it has to manifest itself in stories. We have to see them publish something. The International Federation of Journalists, at the initiative, which was really welcomed, of the journalist union here, the MEAA, this summer in their annual meeting, passed a resolution condemning the treatment of Julian and urging that this extradition would be stopped by all means. This is kind of action on the union level. So there is movement in the right direction. But it's true, we need to see more writing. We need to see more actions by the journalists, because the journalists, yes, they can put pressure on the politicians. And they need to understand, the politicians, that there will be costs if they don't act.
Here on the left.
Hi. Now, tying into that, I'm a simple-minded engineer. I'm not terribly aware of media, but it was pretty clear from about 6-7 years ago to me that what's happening to Julian is going to happen to any other journalist eventually. I mean, that was, the writing was on the wall that you did not need to be a media scientist to figure that out. And I have met a few journalists, and I've seen a lot of ink being spilled against Julian. And I guess, Kristinn, you're a journalist and you know a lot of them. Are they that dumb? Like, seriously, it's baffling the mind. So why would they be against this guy who's basically them? And that, why would they expose themselves to that kind of risk in the future? Because that's a precedent. Why are they doing so little so late? It just blows my mind.
You hold the answer, and we'll just take a couple more. Can you see?
Yeah, this one's to Suelette and Julian. I wanted to know your perspective on the recent assistance and access bill and how that affects tech companies.
My comment to Kristinn is I'm an independent journalist with a particular interest in Syria, and I've been supporting Syria for the last 8 years and trying to alert people about what is actually happening there. And WikiLeaks' recent release of the email to the OPCW referring to is a good case in point, because I wrote a lengthy complaint to SBS over their presentation, their complete failure to report the OPCW, the engineers report, the investigations, and continue to tell stories about chemical weapons attacks blamed on Syria. And this is the state of your sort of WikiLeaks information in this country. And it's much more than the fight to just get some journalists on side. You're fighting.
Well, can I start? We are, yes, it's a fight for the truth. I mean, the obstacles are amazing. Even when you get strong indication of a serious corruption in the process within an international institution which has such an important role, like the Chemical Weapons Watchdog, the OPCW, when you get leaked reports, an indication that there is something very wrong there, it's not reported on it. That is of serious concern. But one story, because you said you were an engineer, right? It came to mind that I was entrusted in sort of overseeing 4 interns at the state broadcaster one summer. They were there for about 3 months, possibly getting a fixed position after that. And after observing their work and the way they worked for a few weeks, I started discussing about how well they had sort of liked the journalism courses at the uni, how well that sort of had helped them in the job. And there was one person of the 4, one girl, who was absolutely way above the others in her quality of her work, and the resilience, and her analytical skills. And she stood up and said, well, no, I'm not like the others. I didn't study journalism. I was in engineering. So I don't know if that tells you anything about the lack of quality of journalism schools, but there is a problem. There is a problem. There is a problem in journalism, and I think it has always been like that. When I complain that there are only a handful of journalists in society that are actually doing good, when I complain about that to sort of seasoned journalists, for example, to John Pilger, he said, it's always been like that. It's always the single journalist who changes history. It's the I think it was Australia and the journalist who actually defied the ban to go to Hiroshima, and wrote the truth about the true effect. Meanwhile, the other embedded journalists were writing stories in the New York Times about that radiation poisoning, I think they call it, was simply a myth. So it was a single guy. All the others were writing about the ceremony where the Japanese formally were giving up. One man, he changed history.
An Australian journalist who had his passport taken off him. Yeah.
Can I ask either of the other two panellists about the AA bill?
So the Access and Assistance Bill, I think it's important to go back to the Metadata Retention Bill. And the reason is because that bill, one of many in a stream of authoritarian bills taking away our right to privacy and individual rights, particularly data rights, since that was passed, I guess, in about a 5-year period, it's been estimated that there have been almost 500,000 warrantless requests for people's metadata by something like 87 agencies. And that, of course, requires things like your ISP and your telco to keep your metadata for 2 years so that without a warrant, a number of these agencies can access that. Why is that important to the Access and Assistance Bill? Because we don't have that data from the Access and Assistance Bill. We don't have it because it's secret, and anyone who reports it goes to prison. That includes all the engineers. And there's no sunset clause on that. It's not like, if you don't report it for a year or 2 years. And there's not the kind of reporting that there should be. In fact, the Attorney General's office has been late, would be the best and kind description, on its public reporting on a number of these key statistics. So both of these bills, the Access and Assistance Bill, which effectively allows the potential backdooring because of vagaries in it by technical staff at the behest of government inside companies, is not only impinging our freedoms and our digital rights, it's actually causing companies to leave Australia. So I think it was the 3rd or 4th company I saw a report of today had packed up and moved to Canada, taking their jobs with them. And not just their jobs of the future. They're jobs that add to our economy, to our export value, all of these things. And so this bill, which was roundly rejected by industry, by business sector, by civil society, by the legal community. In fact, the only people who thought that this bill was a good idea were a set of law enforcement people who gave much of their evidence in camera to the politicians making this decision. So why is this bill important? Because it shows a trend. And that trend is around more and more legislation, regulation, and implementation that impinge on our freedoms. I mean, it is a metastatic poison in our society. This tendency towards authoritarianism is a metastatic poison, and it is getting worse. So it's very important that we speak up about it. And it is very related to this issue, because the last thing that a government that is pushing these things through wants is independent journalists with critical thinking who will speak out and who have a large international audience.
I just wanted to add one more piece of information to complete that picture that may be relevant for tonight, which is that the metadata retention law did contain an exception for journalists. So you were required to obtain a warrant if you were seeking the metadata of a journalist. The passage of the AA Bill Now Act, we should call it what it properly is, actually undermined that provision. So you can now install malware in a journalist's phone to access the location of a source, for example, and that's not considered collecting the metadata of a journalist. That would therefore come under the exception that's there in the metadata laws. Now, what I'm trying to get at here is one of the few concessions that the government gave in the metadata laws was that they didn't want to tamper with the freedom of the press. They understood that journalists had a specific role to play and needed protection. But then they passed another very aggressive piece of legislation which effectively undermined it. And it hands over enormous powers to national security agencies with very limited reporting, almost none, much less than on the metadata retention laws, which I think is an astonishing development. We have seen today the Labor Party has introduced a proposed set of amendments, which is a huge step forward. It's not enough, and I think we should continue to campaign to change them. But I think it does show that parties are susceptible to public pressure and the kinds of condemnation that we saw from industry as well as civil society and others when that law was first discussed.
The other thing that I think is really important about this trend in the legislation is that if Australia wants to be a leader in the Asia Pacific, and part of being a leader is to say we stand up for free and open democracy. This is the kind of world we believe in. It's very hard to do that. It's very hard to be critical of neighbours who do not have great human rights track records when we are passing this sort of legislation ourselves. We have no moral high ground to do it.
All right. So I think we've got time for one or maybe two more questions down here at the front.
Camillo from Melbourne for WikiLeaks. We met with Jennifer Robinson a few times when she was in Melbourne, and we have complete confidence in Julian's legal team. But we're fighting a lot of websites and Facebook pages possibly putting out disinformation about Julian's representation, saying it's been infiltrated and it's they're not doing the right thing. So it's more of a request than a question. Could you consolidate your confidence in his legal team so we can, beat these people on the head? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I have full faith in the legal team. The legal team is comprised of the best people that Julian could get. Gareth Peirce is a historical giant in law, and others on the team are absolutely doing the best they can. And a lot of things are happening behind the scenes. Just to add, so it's not just what you see and hear. But for legal reasons, for strategic reasons, things have to also happen behind the scene, because the lawyers don't want to show all their cards before they go into court. So even if people see or perceive inaction, it doesn't mean things are not being worked on. So I have full faith and confidence. My only concern is that despite the fact that you have this tremendously good team and a huge capacity. And as I said earlier, this is a case that I am afraid will not be ruled on the merits of the law, the political case.
The state is obviously running a campaign of fear against journalists, whistleblowers and the public. I was just wondering if it was having any impact, Kristinn. Are you seeing the leaks still coming through?
There is this misconception about what WikiLeaks did, Julian, in 2010, where we have the basis of these indictments, the collateral murder video, the war docs from Iraq, Afghanistan, and the docs on Guantanamo Bay. And they are straight from the talking points of Pentagon and the State Department. It's the talk of data dumping, the thing you were referring to. That's That's the observation you get. No, this is not responsible journalism. This is data dumping. I'm astonished when I hear this, because, I mean, on the contrary, it was curated. The Afghan war logs, a third of the documents were withheld. When it came to the Iraq war logs, all of the documents were redacted and then placed in the hands of all the, well, probably a couple of hundred journalists for contextualization. And when it came to the diplomatic cables, it was drip-fed through the hands of journalists, 90 media organizations, I think it were, in total in the end, for over 10 months. And we weren't finished. It was only because a Guardian journalist made a very grave error of publishing a password that it was released in totality. But my God, it was a year of curation and careful management. And it takes a lot of effort to manage 90 media organizations, I can tell you. So this accusation about some irresponsibility doesn't hold any water. I mean, you know this didn't happen like that. It's absurd. And it's coming up again and again. And even journalists are echoing this, which is amazing, because the track record is there. And even journalists from media organizations that actually did work on these projects. How amazing is that? So it's somehow this misconception sort of seeps in, something one of very many. And it's very hard to sort of change that perception, but it just doesn't hold any water. I think those were projects that were extremely carefully managed in a very professional manner, journalistically.
What you've just heard is probably material you were not aware of, because journalists have not yet told the full story. We are in a country now where the guilty are being protected and the whistleblowers, I'm thinking of Witness K and Bernard Collaery, are being prosecuted because they told the truth about our country bugging the East Timor embassy. You know, that's outrageous. And yet they're being prosecuted for telling the truth. Assange is being persecuted because he told the truth about what happened. You need to be aware of what is going on in this country and get journalists active, because that's the only way of moving the politics. The legal system here can't do very much to protect Assange in London, but politics can. And I would urge every single one of you to get active about this, especially active about what failings we've seen and heard of tonight in journalism, because let's face it, they can't disappear, every one of us. Because if they do, people will notice.
I was very disappointed to see that Peter Grest, an Australian journalist who spent time in prison in Egypt for his reporting, would write the op-ed that he did about Julian Assange, another Australian journalist sitting in prison. And I was particularly disappointed that Peter, who is a journalist of some repute and who I know, should get his facts wrong in this piece. That he should say that the documents were dumped, unredacted, inaccurately. When they were published, they were dumped, unredacted, and then say that makes Julian Assange not a journalist. First of all, as Kristinn has explained, they were redacted. Second of all, there are actually articles on the WikiLeaks site. They summarize, these are the points, this is the important observation, this is the analysis that a journalist does of this database. I think it's unfortunate that Peter Grest should have published that, and it's more unfortunate that he shouldn't have corrected it, because that is the job of a journalist. But even more so, even if you want to argue about whether this should have been redacted or that shouldn't have been redacted, that doesn't make someone not a journalist or not a publisher. That's an argument about editorial content. Newspapers have that every day of the week. So if you want to take away something to act on today, if I could give you some practical ideas, When you see articles online about WikiLeaks in the mainstream media, go and comment on them. Give comment. If you think that there are things in there that are factually wrong, correct the journalist politely, firmly, correct them. If you think it's more important that journalists actually report on this, that they not ignore it, that they not ignore the story of Australian Julian Assange, publisher sitting in a British prison, when there are other journalism freedom stories reported, write that in the comments section. They do get read. They are really important. And if you send one letter, one email, send it to the PM, CC it to the Leader of the Opposition, and CC it to a journalist. That's my advice.
Wonderful. Now, I know that Jacob did want to speak, I believe, on behalf of Melbourne for WikiLeaks about some of the practical things that we can all do.
Oh, look, very, very briefly, I'm from Melbourne for WikiLeaks, and I'd like to thank all the four of you for coming. Could we give them another big hand, please? But also, and most importantly, it's great that you're at things like tonight, but it's not enough. You need to keep coming to things like this. And as well as Suelette said, getting in touch and doing the work yourself, we've got a sign-up sheet outside. We can put your name, your number, your email address, whatever you want to give us, and we'll let you know what's going on. And we guarantee you that by the end of the year, we'll have you at another event, either something a little bit like this, or maybe we'll have you climbing Parliament House and dropping a flag over it. Who knows? But either way, put your name out the front. Thank you.
David Hicks. David Hicks. He is not in Guantanamo. He is not in chains. He is here in Australia. And that was enormous work by his family, by the community. These things can be changed. Chelsea Manning, although back in detention now, was freed from a prison that was 35 years. And that happened not because Barack Obama wanted to do it. It's because of the community pressure that was brought to bear. So this is possible. It is possible.
So these are the kinds of discussions that I think we'd like to see continue, how we can put pressure on various people who hold power in our society to protect freedom of the press, to protect our democracy, and to protect political prisoners like Julian Assange. I did want to offer a note of thanks to the staff here at the State Library who've been very accommodating and generous with their time. I wanted to thank the many volunteers who've contributed to making tonight a success, to getting the word out, to helping broadcast this on social media, to Felicity for her tireless efforts in putting this event together. And would you please join me in thanking our three wonderful panellists for coming tonight and sharing their expertise and views.